Welcome to Elixir Mix, your weekly Elixir podcast talking with members of the community. My name is Mark Erickson. On our panel today, we have Josh Adams.
Yo.
And our special guest today is Anders Smedegaard Pedersen. I hope
Hello.
I said that appropriately enough.
Yeah, that was fine.
Glad you could
very
come
nice. Yeah,
So-
nice to be here.
If you could please just kind of give a little introduction to yourself for the benefit of our listeners.
Right. So I'm from Denmark. Moved to Norway in 2009, where eventually I got undergrad in computer science, and I started working as a developer just a few years ago. In regards to Elixir, I went to this conference in Trondheim, Norway a few years ago, and there was this random guy called Jose Valim who had this talk and about Elixir, of course. And at the time, I didn't really think much about it. But at some point, I wanted to learn functional programming, and I Googled around and actually just went for Elixir because of the documentation. It was so good that I thought I could learn this on my own. So yeah, that's me. Right now I'm working as a consultant, and I'm doing Android development. So yeah.
Very cool. So I was curious as to, that was part of my question. You say you're currently doing Android. So are you doing any Elixir stuff professionally, or is that still just growing as an interest?
Yeah, just as a hobby. As everybody else you talk to, basically, that's not working with Elixir, I hope to land a job where I could do some Elixir at some point.
Do you do Kotlin or straight Java?
Kotlin. So
Okay. Have you seen Erlang's J interface?
No, I haven't.
You should play with it. It's neat. It interfaces Java to an Erlang network.
Yeah, actually, that might be a Dane who wrote that, if I'm not mistaken. I went to Codebeam in London in November and talked to the guy. If I'm thinking about the right thing, so yeah,
Yeah,
I have to check that out.
It's part of the standard library, but I wouldn't be too surprised.
Okay. That's cool. I'll have to check that out.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
Well, one of the reasons we wanted to invite you on is you are kind of newer to the Elixir community, and you'd recently had some experiences and you blogged about it and shared what kind of was going on. And we thought this was interesting and of interest to our listeners. And so one of the things is, so you're coming as not a newcomer to programming, but but a newcomer to the community. And you're already, doing development. You're doing Android development, and I'm sure you've played with other things too. But I'm just kind of curious, what has as you kind of came into the environment or the community, what was your experience like?
Well, at first, when I first grasped pattern matching and all that stuff you have to learn, and it seems everybody who actually understands it at some point fall in love with it. The pipe operators and other thing that's mentioned very often. That's just so cool, and it's so easy to reason about pure functions and stuff like that. So that was the stuff that I kind of fell in love with, that I feel like everybody else falls for. Yeah.
So one of the things that I found very interesting about your experience is that you you kind of came onto Elixir forum and you asked this question, and this was around, let me see, I can pull it up. This was around April. And there was a lot of discussion in the community that was kind of talking about like, oh, do you really need a database?
Yeah.
And you can, possibly even create Elixir applications that are just all state is managed in Gen servers. And oh, I don't actually go and create tables until I've kind of validated the design through in-memory Gen servers. And so your question was basic, it was like, what the heck's going on?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I was, you wanted to get into that in a more dynamic way. Yeah, that's cool. Okay. So we can take it up from there. Right. So when I first got over the honeymoon and started to build stuff and started to following podcasts and the Elixir forum and started reading, I started to notice there was some opinions and biases that was kind of prohibited me, I think, or at least made me confused. There was a lot of talk about umbrella apps, and I felt like basically I was told, air quotes, told about the community, by the community, that everything should be in an umbrella, and it was just kind of silly not to put everything in an umbrella, because then you could reuse modules and stuff. So that made me feel a bit bad that I hadn't put my stuff in an umbrella, and I didn't really understand at the time what that was. Also, I read a book written by Lance Halvorsen, I think, about Phoenix and Elixir web development. And he promotes that you shouldn't necessarily just jump into Phoenix with Ecto and so on. You should really discover your domain in pure Elixir, make that work, and then maybe if you actually need a web interface, you can go use Phoenix. And this whole reading this book kind of confused me even more, to the point where I wrote a post on the Elixir forum asking, do you really need a database? And yeah, for a person who just got into the language, got into functional, thinking about transient data and what that actually means and what you should store and so forth was just a big mouthful. So that kind of got me less enthusiastic about the Elixir.
Yeah, I sympathize with you, because this path of coming in new to a community, and especially I think this is characteristic of communities that are in a rapid stage of growth, where you have a lot of people coming in from different directions. You have people coming from Java, people coming from Ruby, people coming from Clojure, whatever. They're coming with all these different perspectives. And I don't think it's a problem exclusive to Elixir, because, like Josh and I, we talked before, like we both kind of, at least I'm playing with some Flutter apps for mobile development, and I'm new to that environment. And as a newbie in there, then everyone's saying, oh, you got to do it this way, or you got to do it that way. And it gets really intimidating, because you're like, oh gosh, well, maybe I can't do anything until I do it perfectly and I understand all of it.
My trick is to just do stuff wrong a lot.
I think that's the right answer.
That's what I do in Flutter. I wrote a package that I know absolutely is definitely not Fluttery, but it solved a problem. And I hope someone will come and provide some pull requests to make it better. But for now, it works for me.
Yeah, it's a good strategy. But I kind of went into my hobby projects with Elixir and Phoenix with the mindset of, okay, I'm going to make this a relatively simple app, but I want to do it right, air quotes, right. So I wanted to have the test coverage. I wanted to have like the correct structure, again, air quotes around correct. I want to use this new fantastic tool that I discovered to do something in a correct way, but I didn't know what correct was. So that was a big problem, I guess. I hadn't really defined what I was looking for or wanted to do.
Yeah, that is a challenge, because I don't even know that there is a correct. And I just want to kind of say to you, dear listener, if you are newer to Elixir and you are, in that similar situation where you're thinking, you can get kind of frozen, right? Where you don't move forward because you're like, I don't want to do it wrong. I want to do it right from the beginning. It's like, you just got to kind of go with it. And if you're just starting with just a Phoenix app and use a database, get started with that. Like especially if you're coming from something like Rails, where that's like the norm, just get started and don't freak out about how it needs to be perfect. Because like iteration 2 or 3, or, play with small projects, you can iterate. You can try out an umbrella. You can find a good guide that tells you, how to do TDD with Elixir, whatever it is. It's like, just don't let that be what freezes you up. And
just do something fun. Like, programming is fun. Make sure it's fun, or you won't follow on.
Exactly. And it needs to solve a problem that you actually care about. At least I find that most helpful.
Right. That I actually had a few ideas I wanted to do. So I got that right. But also during my first Phoenix project, they released 1.4 and introduced context and stuff.
Right.
And that kind of threw a wrench in my whole thinking. Darn it. Now I have to rewrite this whole thing to make it correct again. So it's like the theme again is for the people out there getting started, just find a way to do it and have fun. That's probably the whole takeaway of this this talk here.
Yeah. And so fortunately, you were at an Elixir conference, and you ran into Claudio Ortolina, who we've previously had as a guest as well. And so how did he help you in that situation?
Yeah, so I actually I went to London for the London Elixir thing. A few months ago, and Erlang Solutions offered to just that you could talk with one of their consultants about anything Elixir or Erlang. And I thought, well, I might as well just go and talk to them. So they put me together with Claudio, who's a really nice guy, and we just I was kind of apologetic because I thought this was meant for people who have Elixir Erlang in production, and I just had my small hobby projects, and I told him pretty much what I've told you now. And his advice was that I should, don't get overwhelmed and define a small project, and maybe do something with nerves. That's fun. And it turned out I'd actually considered doing something in nerves already. I do home brewing, and I had this thermometer hooked up to a Raspberry Pi, and I'd written like a temperature logger in Node.js. So I thought, okay, something I've already implemented must be like an easy thing to do. I know what I want to do. I have like the specs, so to speak, a very clear, concise idea of I can do this with nerves. So I thought, okay, I'll just rewrite my temperature thing in nerves. So that's what I did when I got home from the conference. Yeah.
And how did that go?
It's not finished, but I did make some progress. At the point it logs it outputs the temperature of 2 sensors, and works in it's a gen server who's reading the temperature, so you get all the nice stuff you get for free from OTP. If something should crash, it can reboot itself and so forth.
So the most important question, was it fun?
Yes, it was. And it still is. The project's been on standby for a while now because of work and so forth, but it's still in development. But I'm really happy with what I have now, and it was really fun to do, and I learned a lot about gen servers and all that stuff doing this. So it's been great fun.
We'll put a link to that. You wrote a blog article kind of talking about that first nerves project, and so we'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can kind of follow along with what you were doing there.
Cool.
So is your hope to eventually do more with home brewing and nerves? Is that what you'd like to see happen?
I mean, for me, home brewing is a hobby, and it's supposed to be just a hobby. And being kind of a geeky IoT interested guy is a really good fit for brewing because there's a lot of measuring and stuff. Justin Sneck is one of the core members on Nerves, is also a home brewer, and he's actually done something quite similar. So it's a perfect fit. But I'd like to explore IoT in a more general sense using Nerves. So yeah.
Do you have any other Nerves projects you're thinking about now that you've been playing with it a bit?
Well, nothing specific, but I'd like to put my so-called knowledge about programming and development into maybe like clean energy, a green energy. So I haven't found the right idea yet, but I hope to venture into that field using nerfs somehow. Yeah.
It's awesome to have lofty goals. I just want to open and close chicken coop doors.
Yeah, that's a noble goal as well. The chickens needs to get out.
I was just looking for a talk at ElixirConf 2018. There was a presentation that I attended. It was about nerves, and it was about growing algae and using it for the temperature sensors and everything, and then harvesting the algae. And I was just looking for a link to this, and I found it. I'll put that in the show notes. It is my first bioreactor with I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name. His name's David, but I'll put that in the show notes. I just thought it was interesting that you mentioned like the idea of clean energy or green, and just that other people share this interest, and nerves might be a good fit as to a way to keep small IoT style devices that are just monitoring temperatures and outputs and sensors, and you're collecting data off of sensors and aggregating that and doing something just interesting, even if it's just a hobby, just something fun with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at least for the networking stuff, it's a match made in heaven. So anything you could do with connected devices, gathering data, like manipulating stuff. FarmBot is also a huge, as far as I remember, they use nerves as well. So that's it's as I said, it's a match made in heaven. It's so easy, and you get all the good stuff from OTP, which is battle tested through a few decades. So it should be possible to make something cool with nerves and Elixir, definitely.
Yeah. I do want to kind of come back to some of our previous discussion around correctness. And so you'd mentioned a few of the different things, like umbrellas was one. Phoenix is not your app. Do I even need a database? These kinds of ideas. And so let's just talk about them together. Like, I'd love to hear everyone's opinion on, is there a right way? And, what would you do as a first approach? Like, what is okay? Like, so Josh, like, do you use umbrellas? How do you approach that?
These days, I tend to use umbrellas for basically any project. And the first thing that I do is build my data layer, which typically stores data in Ecto. So like right now we're working on a project, and we've only just started adding the actual Ecto bits, but the actual database bits, but we used Ecto schemas to represent the data so that we could construct them with factories using Ex Machina, to basically provide our GraphQL endpoints so that it's actually a Flutter and Absinthe app. And so our Flutter app makes requests. The first thing we did was mock out the screens, no Elixir there. And then we mocked out the data that we needed and sort of defined the queries. Then we defined the schema and provided mock data. And right now we're in the process of going through, and now that the GraphQL is all wired up to the front end, actually going through and using the database to get the data rather than return mock data. And so I think we got most of that done today. But like, that's my typical flow in that sort of application. Mm-hmm. But also, like, one of my favorite things about Elixir is building things that are not like the normal thing I build. So, we're doing work for people. I do a lot of line of business applications that are very, hey, put a database on the internet. And they are more interesting than that these days, but that's still a big part of it. But so when I'm doing like side projects or just something for fun, like when I built a Tetris application, and it has no database. It's just, it stores games in memory. And then if you restart it, they're all gone. And obviously I could persist the games, right? I could have the process being the game, write them to disk or write them to a file or whatever, write them to the database. But I really enjoy that style, but mostly my sort of consulting type work, we're using Postgres and I'm using Ecto.
Yeah, it was interesting as you kind of started describing it. It's like, wow, I do that exactly. But yes, like I use Ex Machina to help. It's a library for factories for generating test data. I use that. I also I do enjoy the umbrella where with a web separate from like a core business logic app, and I typically always call that core. But yeah, it's Postgres, Ecto, and I mean, really, that has solved like that approach has solved just about every problem I've hit. And then there are other kind of edge things that I've encountered that might take a slightly different approach. But one thing I want to point out is it is okay. Like if you are new to Elixir, it is okay not worrying about the umbrellas, because just getting started with an umbrella, there is a little bit more to be aware of, especially once you start adding multiple apps and just understanding the relationships between the apps. And it's like, don't let that hang you up. Don't even go there if that's going to cause you problems, right? Just get started with a Phoenix app, right?
Yeah, and really, like umbrellas are only super valuable, in my opinion, when like you're deploying and you want some nodes to only run some of the applications in the umbrella. If you're always running all the applications, then they could very well just live under one parent supervisor and just put them in library directories. But I still make umbrellas because it's not actually very, very complicated to do. And among other things, that means I can sort of run independent tests. Like each thing is its own standalone thing. And it helps me think through my dependency requirements as well. Because if I've got a dependency on another application in my umbrella, some of my apps will have 10 things in the umbrella. And it becomes very clear if I have a dependency. I can think like, does this really need to be here? Or is the piece that like uses this, should it compose the other piece?
Right. Yeah. I share the same view. So we're just saying we're not going to have a good argument here.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/elixir. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
One question I do have is, like from the beginning, I got the impression that if you put a number of modules in an umbrella, or a number of projects, you would more easily be able to pull them out. If you have some generic component you might want to reuse in a whole another project. That was the impression I got.
I think it depends. Like if you're I think it really depends. So I don't think it really makes them that much easier to pull out, except in as much as you're more in control of what dependencies they have.
Right.
Because like if you have a directory in your lib folder, and then you just in your supervisor start any processes that it needs, or start its supervisor that manages its dependencies, then like that's very easy to extract too, and you don't have to have an umbrella to do that. So I think that's sort of minimally true. But
right.
I think the real benefit for me in that is having explicitly the dependencies, its own mixed project where I can be more clear about what it depends on.
Right, because I was thinking about the version control and stuff. If you actually want to do that, you have to have Git submodules and so forth, which is not,
Yeah, you want to avoid Git submodules if you can.
Yeah. So Nerves kind of promotes a poncho structure, which is...
I haven't heard it called that. That's fun.
Okay, right. So it's actually just, two mixed projects living in the same directory, and you just fetch the dependency using path. So it just lives next to each other. And I found that really nice, actually, because when I did the temperature thing, I kind of just, went ahead and made it work in a naive way. And then when you progress, you start to split things apart and divide code into files and modules that kind of make sense. So I actually split the whole bit that actually reads the temperature of the physical device into a module. And then I have a module that, handles has a gen server and has the supervisor and stuff like that. So that actually worked out really nicely. And they live in separate Git repositories. So I thought that was a nice way to do it.
That's cool. One of the benefits I do see now with nerves, I'm sure there's some different dynamics going on there because of the way it runs embedded. And I would love to spend more time and just kind of dig into nerves more. I just haven't set aside the time yet, and I keep needing to do it. But with umbrellas, one of the things I do like about that is the idea of, like, currently I work on a project where there's, I don't know, maybe it's a kind of an SOA. It's not like microservices. There are several, like 7 or so services that are, like a Phoenix app, one's a Rails app, several Phoenix apps, that kind of thing. And being able to have integration tests that go across everything is really easy in an umbrella, because everything gets loaded, all the dependencies just kind of load things up, start them up in the right order, so I can have higher level integration style tests, which I find very helpful. And just kind of going back to what Josh said, using, like, being able to do mixed test on just an app is helpful. And doing like dialyzer on just an app is really helpful. But yeah, I think the main benefit that I was seeing with umbrellas was code organization. I've just seen a lot of people unintentionally, theoretically, you can do with a Phoenix app, just with your lib folder and organizing it, you can manage have a really well-structured app. But it becomes tempting and easy to start kind of interlacing these different code dependencies. And when you forcibly move things out into separate apps, it makes that harder. You feel it more, and it helps me kind of like start to think, okay, like Josh was saying, okay, is this even the right place to do this?
I think that's helpful. In the same way, I think the whole functional programming paradigm is helpful, because you're constrained in some ways, and it makes you think in a different way, but it also results in I was about to say better code. That's but it's easier just to separate concerns and have pure functions, and it gets easier to reason about. And I think code structure, if you force some kind of structure upon yourself, it gives you a framework to help you reason about your code, separate concerns and all that.
So that's a good lead into a follow-up question from some of these kind of your story as you kind of came to the community and experienced all these different do it this way, do it that way kind of problems. So one of you talked about how Phoenix 1.4 came out, and there were contexts, and the idea of these, contexts as kind of a domain. Like, what was that like in terms of like coming to that as a code organization approach? Did that make sense? Did you struggle with that? What was that like?
I actually like the idea very much. I didn't get too far with it because I got so discouraged at that point. It was, I think that was like the drop that just made, made me, yeah, it just put me off. I felt like I'd gotten, to a nice place with my hobby project, my previous hobby project. And I was kind of, getting somewhere. And then the talk came out on YouTube and it was like, oh no. I'm gonna put this on ice and just wait till I find some inspiration again. So I actually honestly I haven't used context that much because I haven't done anything in Phoenix unless some I've played around with channels this last month or two, which are very nice, and again a perfect match for IoT stuff. But I haven't played too much with context, but I actually do like the idea because again, it's a pattern, a structure to help you get some structure on your code, be very conscious about what each part of the code are supposed to do. So I like the idea.
Yeah, I like them a lot because I had started doing that in my Ruby code before I sort of migrated to Elixir. And honestly, in Elixir, I had in my Phoenix apps, I'd backed off from sort of what I considered new best practices in Ruby. Now in Ruby, if you use Active Record, but you wrap it up in your internal API, and no one's supposed to talk to Active Record at any point except for inside there, people get real mad and think that you write weird code. So I at least like that other people look at code that I write this way now and they don't go, why would you ever do this? I mean, we should just call the database from the view. So I like a lot that at the very least we've, in the Elixir community, that's more the norm than the exception.
Yeah, that is funny. That is true. I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective. Like, why not just talk directly to the database from the view? I mean, that's like, PHP. Oh no.
Yeah.
But with contexts, one of the things I talk with a lot of people who a lot of them are coming newer to Elixir. And one of the questions I hear a lot is about code organization. Like, how do you structure a project? So I think a lot of people are coming with Anders' kind of experience of like, what is the right way? And I don't know that there is a right way, but the community is slowly kind of coalescing around, this seems to be a good practice. And so in terms of, I'd love to hear like, even with like Android apps, and Josh with you with Elixir or whatever, or Flutter, like just how do you approach code organization? Like you've got all these files and you want to structure them in some meaningful way. How do you approach that, especially kind of thinking of Elixir too?
So like I mostly organize things in the, sort of in the contexty way. And I definitely am not doing proper bounded contexts by any stretch. They are not bounded. They talk to each other. And in theory, they shouldn't. In practice, it has not come back to bite me yet. So it just is not a concern of mine. Though I definitely sort of occasionally feel like this isn't as clean as it should be. It just hasn't been worth actually taking that extra step. But yeah, I mean, generally I pick a bucket of behavior and I give it a name, and then the stuff related to that bucket of behavior is inside a subdirectory and namespaced module wise. And that's typically enough for me in almost any language.
Yeah, that's when I kind of started seeing contexts and being talked about in the community some time ago. As you kind of poke around inside of well-written Elixir libraries, or even, like Ecto being a library, Timex being a library, you just kind of poke around inside any of these, even standard lib kind of Elixir stuff. You just kind of start to notice that it has this hierarchical structure. And, that you have like an entry point that is kind of your top level, like this is really where you should start when you're talking to this library. And that seemed like a very sensible way to go, especially with Elixir where, you know, you really don't have private data types. You know, you can't prevent someone from digging all the way deep down into your stuff and, like, you know, messing with the internals of a struct. You know, you can't really encapsulate that and, you know, enforceably like you can with objects. So it all comes down to like convention and like, well, I know if I dug down really deep into this library, I can't count on that not breaking in a future release, because that's like their internals. And I think contexts use the same approach, right? It's like if I have a conceptual view of what my business app does, right? Maybe it's, you know, a blog being the stupid kind of, you know, go-to idea, but like I have a thing of, you know, posts and users and, you know, comments and so like you have these ideas of like, well, a lot of these concepts can be grouped together under one context. They don't, you know, I don't have to have a context for each entity type, right? I don't have to have a context for a comment. You know, that might be part of, you know, a post. Maybe I have a context called posts and it has, you know, I don't know. So it's like, I'm just kind of making it up as I go along. But so like kind of when you kind of, Josh, I'm thinking like when you're talking about Elixir contexts, how do you narrow it down? I think of it as like a hierarchy where it's like a pyramid where that entry point is at the top. And how do you kind of decide what belongs up there at the top of like where I enter this context from?
Yeah, right now I am way more granular than I want to be long term. So I do a lot of like a context for, so like I'm doing a forum, and so I have a context for threads. In a previous iteration, I had just a forums context, but it was really big, right? Because that's the whole app is a forum, and there were a few ancillary things that weren't particularly related to forumness necessarily. But you know, it felt like that was a bit too broad of a context. So what I tend to do is I make these small granular ones, because inevitably, even though I have a posts context, I don't just have a post schema in it, right? I have post views, and I have other things related to sort of helpers for posts. And eventually, when it feels like this is a bit wonky, it's a little awkward to always be, you know, for each of these things to have their own context, then I'll make a facade that's just a sort of a context module that literally just uses the other ones. And maybe I'll remove documentation from the other ones so that people aren't encouraged to use those, and they use the primary entry point, but I still have them. So that's kind of my strategy, is eventually wrap things up in a facade. But initially I go wild, making more granular context than is probably reasonable, because I find going towards a facade is easier than stripping stuff out if I went the other way first.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I actually do the same thing and I hadn't thought about it. So like, yeah. So like say you have a thing called a post, right? So I would have just the convention I've used, I've kind of picked this up from other people, I guess, is that I would have a context called posts, being plural. And that is my interface for doing a lot of CRUD actions. And then I would have, and then I might even have some other stuff like, you know, where I could have a by user kind of function that would return posts for, like I would pass in a user. But yes, like it's the idea of I have a context, like I call them mini contexts, which is kind of what I think you were describing. It's like the context around the main database access for an entity. And then I do have like an example, a system I work on is deals with applicants. And so like there's an ATS kind of idea of a context. And so an ATS has applicants, applications, you know, all these different, you know, things they're applying to. And so you can kind of group all of those, like that's that higher order thing you're talking about. But then still deeper within like that folder structure, I'll have a mini context, you know, I just calling it that, for accessing each of those different relationships, or those, you know, like actually getting applicants by an ID or something like that. So I think we're on the same page there.
Yeah, I have basically two rules. The first one is like that context module is the only thing that can talk about the repo, right?
Yeah.
And I hold to that 95% of the time, and it should be 100. And I've forgotten my other rule briefly, so I'm sorry about that. I started off with more to say than this.
Well, I wanted to come back to, so Anders has kind of pointed out the Poncho code organization. So why don't you tell us about that? Because we're going to drop this note, this link that's to a nerves documentation. We'll drop that in the show notes, so everyone can check that out. But why don't you kind of walk us through kind of how they structure this?
Yeah. So as I kind of touched upon before, it's actually just, well, the documentation page you're referring to is for nerves, as you said, and they have a page on user interfaces. And so the example is that you would use Phoenix to have a user interface for your nerves device, and it's actually just making a directory, and you would do mix nerves new, and call give your firmware some name, your nerves project, and then in the same folder you do a mix Phoenix new, and usually you would strip out Ecto. Usually you don't really need that for the interface. So you have a nerves project and a Phoenix project living side by side, and in your firmware mix.exs you just add your UI as a dependency using the path atom. So where it pulls in the UI, and you need to configure some networking and stuff. But as I touched upon before, it makes it super clean and super easy to split out stuff. So in my hobby project, I have at this point I actually have 4 projects side by side. I'm trying to implement this. I'm trying to implement something called CoAP, which is this protocol used for IoT devices. It was it's super lightweight, and so I just kind of picked it up somewhere and actually found a blog post. There was this guy who did a project with nerves and CoAP actually a few years ago. So I just wanted to do the same. So I have a project in my poncho just called CoAP, and that's going to be responsible for that whole bit, handling that protocol. So it's super easy to handle, super easy to have version control on each bit of the whole project, and it's cool. I don't know if it makes more sense for nerves than for like a web app centric application, but it's something to check out at least.
Yeah, I think that's a good resource, and we'll include that in the show notes. But it's a choosing your project structure for a nerves app when you're talking about your user interface. And what I think is great about this little article is it's part of the official documentation. Is they're saying, here's how you do it using a poncho structure, and here's how you do it using an umbrella structure. And they link to a blog post that explain why umbrella projects can be problematic for nerves projects. So that's something just to be aware of. I think thanks for sharing that. But I think we're about out of time. Is there anything more we want to mention, or before we go to picks?
No.
Awesome. Well, let's go to picks then. Josh, do you have something for us?
I do have something. So there's this article that's just a recap of front-end development in 2018. And it's sort of broadly interesting. Just an interesting thing to read through. And also separately, I'll pick Elm because I will always pick Elm. It's amazing.
Yeah, thumbs up for Elm. I had to write some vanilla JavaScript a few days ago, and I haven't written any JavaScript for a long time, and it was, yeah, I wanted to go to Elm, but I couldn't for this. So
yeah, I'm doing a lot of Flutter, and there are places where it's super declarative feeling, and then there are places where I have to go do imperative things, and every time I do that, I don't regret using Flutter. I think Flutter is great, but it makes me yearn for an Elm native.
right.
That would be cool. Well, I'll go next. So kind of going along with our topic today of, being new to a community and not wanting to get bogged down in all the different mindsets or perspectives about how you should do something, right? One of the things I find helpful for myself is I try to set a goal for like today. Like, what is my goal today? And I think that's really helpful when I have a larger goal that I'm working towards, like a goal that might be a 30-day goal. And then the idea is, like, if I have this larger goal, and it could be building a temperature sensing IoT device, nerves project. It could be fleshing out like a Phoenix app. It could be anything, fitness related, whatever. But then the idea is that I think my goal, I have that 30-day goal, that bigger goal in mind, and I have, what can I do today to move that forward? And even if it's like today is going to be a bad day, a lot of stuff comes up. It's like, okay, well, I've only got maybe 10 minutes. What is something I can do that just moves me forward a little bit more? Just because one of the things is losing momentum just kills my energy and drive for keeping going. So like if I just do something at least a little bit every day just to keep my momentum going, then it's like I feel like I'm getting stuff done. And then you get more energy. I get more energy just by having that. So I guess my pick is having a bigger goal, and then what can I do today to push me towards that goal? So that's my pick.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say the same. And as you say, if you're really busy and you literally just have 10 minutes, just change that CSS style that is bugging you, some color or whatever. Just write 2 lines of code, put it down, and feel good about those 2 lines. That's enough to keep your momentum going if you really don't have any time. Yeah.
Awesome. And Anders, do you have something for us?
Actually, I have 2 things I want to share. I'll start with the technical one. It's a book on the pragmatic bookshelf I'm reading at the moment. Property-based testing with proper Erlang and Elixir. And that's by Fred Herbert. It's in beta right now, so it's not quite finished, but it's definitely, it's worth starting on if you want to get into property-based testing. One thing that kind of put me off a bit is that he's not using, since he's actually coming from Erlang, he's not using stream data and quick check, but he's using proper. But it's fine. He has these parts about how you're supposed to actually find the properties which are super useful, and he also have these gotcha boxes or warnings that if something is different in quick check, watch out because something. So it's just a super nice book if you want to get into property-based testing. The other thing I wanted to pick is a book called Search Inside Yourself. and it's by a guy named Chait-Ming Tan, who used to work at Google. And he did this this course internally in Google called Search Inside Yourself. So it's about it kind of comes from like Buddhist philosophy, and mindfulness is the word, I guess. But reading it was super cool. I think he kind of tackles the whole mindfulness from an engineer's point of view. And there's this one phrase he uses a lot, which goes something like that the other person that you might be upset with is also a human being, and he or she wants to be happy and free of suffering, I guess. So even just, you receive a pull request which makes you unhappy and kind of makes you twist, just taking a breath and trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes is super useful for any person, and definitely for developers. And I think especially for when you're working remote and you don't actually see the face of the other person you're working with, just being able to take a step back and take a breath is super useful. So that's my other pick.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Anders, for coming on today. And if people would like to follow you online or connect with you, where should they go to do that?
So I'm not active on basically any social media. But if you do want to connect with me, I am on the Elixir Slack. Do send me a PM or something, because I don't actually monitor the channels, but send me a message there, or go to my website maybe. We'll put that in the show notes, I guess. So
Awesome. All right, I got a link to that. All right, well, I think that's it then for today, and we hope you will join us next week on Elixir Mix.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.